I'm going to make a start anyway. Welcome everybody to the CAS Research Seminar on, sorry, I've done it again. I always say the CAS Research Seminar at the beginning, the AAD Research Seminar. That's how many times I've said that sentence. Welcome to the AAD Research Seminar. This week's seminar is featuring two London Met colleagues, Paola Leonardi and Shai Akram. And Shai is a designer, educator and researcher based in East London. She's got an ongoing fascination with culturally and geographically specific making techniques and an obsession for natural and scientific phenomena. And Shai's presentation today is called Manufacturing Narratives, a dialogue between vernacular craft and globalized industry. And that's the topic of Shai's PhD. We're also going to hear from Paola Leonardi, and she's going to discuss her photographic project called Borderlands, the Edges of Europe. Paola is Italian, and she's a London-based photographer and senior lecturer here at London Met. She completed an MA in Image and Communications in 2006, and since then she's worked commercially as well as developing personal projects. I don't know if you can hear the fireworks in the background, but somebody's letting them off practically right outside my back door. Her work has been previously sponsored by the Arts Council and by the European Cultural Foundation. And she's worked in Copenhagen, the UK, Italy, Armenia, and the US. So today's seminar is entitled Clashing Scales, because both of our presenters, although they're talking about very different topics, they're both considering the question of events that happen at a very small human personal scale and how those relate to global scale understanding of flows and events. If you'd like to follow the research seminar on Twitter, then please do. Our Twitter handle is @research_LMArts. And the full, oh, Uzma, you've given me some information about how to share. Thank you. I'll do that in a moment. The full schedule for the AAD research seminar is now online. And if you just type into Google AAD research seminar, it'll take you to the page, and I will put the full schedule address into the chat box. Now, usually we have both presenters doing their presentation, and then we have a chaired discussion afterwards. If you come up with comments, or you'd like to say how great the presentations are, or if you've got any questions, do stick it into the chat. It's great to have some conversation about the presentation topics in the chat while the presentations are going on. So I'm going to hand you over now to Shai. I'm going to make you host, Shai.
Excellent.
Shai and her children.
Shai and my
featuring
children being pretty wild in the back. I don't know why.
That's really nice.
Can you still hear me all right over them?
Absolutely, yeah.
Okay, great.
So now we can see your whole, oh yeah. So we can see your whole presentation at the moment.
Cool. There we go. Can you only see the slide now, or can you see some faces?
I can just see the slide, but I can also see a colour selection window with some pencils on it. The bottom right. Maybe if you could, it looks like part of, if you could close that window.
Yeah. My system has run out of application memory, of course. How's that?
Perfect.
Great. Okay. So, hello everyone. I'm Shai, and as Jane mentioned, I'm a designer and a maker, but I'm also currently I'm doing my PhD, and there's no real distinction between my academic research and professional practice, or even my personal interests. As you heard, I'm really interested in making. I spend a lot of time in factories, and I'm on site a lot, getting physically involved with the translation of ideas into physical objects is something I'm really interested in, and I'm actively involved with. In particular, the relationship between craft and industry, the hand in the machine, and the effect of human sensitivities on like a mechanized production line. This is manifested in lots of channels in my work. One of them predominantly, and the one that I've been able to realise more projects with, is through my commercial work. I design interiors and furniture.
Shai, sorry to interrupt you. I'm really sorry to interrupt you, but one of the participants has asked you to talk a bit closer to your microphone.
Yes, do you know what? I'm just going to go and sit on a different chair that's further away from the bathroom too. So they can't, it's a very open plan living space, unfortunately. So you can hear everything that happens everywhere.
What's so cool and trendy before children suddenly becomes incredibly impractical.
Yeah, so as I was saying, I'm very interested in getting stuck into making, and the way I've come to that is through practice, and largely through furniture and spaces with a studio that I run with my partner called Studio Alt Shift. But more recently, I'm in the early stages of my PhD. I really enjoy getting involved with how things are made. I love everything about the whole process: materials, tools, swatches, tests, blanks, molds, and I especially love watching skill, whether it's a very local or vernacular handcraft level, or in a huge industrial scale. And I'm just very impressed by it. And that's why I wrote my PhD proposal, to be able to spend and dedicate a large part of my time basically watching and understanding making. As I said, I'm in the very early stages, and the working title is Manufacturing Narratives, a dialogue between vernacular craft and globalized industry. And the research really focuses on disappearing craft practices and the important role that they can play in innovation in new creative economies. One of the bits of text that I wrote for my PhD proposal said that I view the relationship as a powerful liberator of material language, placing craft techniques within the industrial model and working together to uncover new market possibilities and disrupt the monotony of global uniformity, because everything looks the same when it comes out of a factory, basically. So while I've been doing my research, I came across this piece of writing. 10 years ago, Heli Ongarius and Louise Schoenberg published Beyond the New. They were really disappointed with some work that they saw during Milan. I actually think it was Milan, or it might have been Design Week Eindhoven during that year 2010. But it prompted them to put together a manifesto that called for a look at how we produce new objects. They spoke a lot about evolving existing processes and being careful with what we already have, to use it with intelligence and to uncover as yet unseen or underutilized possibilities. I've got a couple of excerpts, and I'm paraphrasing for time purposes. But one thing that she wrote was, "Count the blessings of industry. Industrial processes have greater potential than low volume production of exclusive designs, which reach a much limited market, and the talk of users can hardly be taken seriously. Industries can make high quality products available to many people, and this is the key part, we should breathe new life into that ideal." And then she goes on to say that cultural and historical awarenesses are woven into the DNA of any worthwhile project, and talks about the value of continually re-examining what already exists and delving into archives, poring over the classics. And she asks, what untapped potential do the material, colours, functions and forms still hold? So it was kind of a reaction to all the things that were new just for the sake of newness. And I felt like I shared lots of values with this manifesto, even though it may sound, when you read it, it's pretty hard and serious, the way that she's talking about things. But knowing Heli Ongarius's work with colour and her role at Vitra. She's the creative director for colour and materials there, and the importance that she puts on humanness and living colour and playing with processes. I felt like she was talking about maybe being a bit more playful with how we work with materials, kind of from a methodological point of view, something a bit more ludic, where the research, where it has a clear value, but it's not got a predefined output or product in mind. So this brings me to the first of my projects that I was going to share with you. I feel it has the same kind of ludic spirit. It was a residency at a Dutch manufacturers called Arco. Their slogan is, "We make tables," and they do very, very well. And to this end, they have an enormous amount of expertise and skill within their factory. And in order to find new outputs for these skills, they invited 10 designers to come and play for a week in their factory. It was pretty amazing. There were a lot of outputs. And actually, the first picture I showed you was within the factory itself. Some went into production, some were starting points for other projects, and others were just prototypes of experiments. I chose to look at an overlap between the amazing craft skills of the master veneerers in the factory and the traditional craft of marquetry. And there was a lot of otherwise beautifully finished items that were rejected because there'd been a dust particle or a splinter trapped through the layers of the veneers, and it had only become apparent at the end when they did the final sanding. So what I thought I would do is make an adaptation or a disruption of the finishing process where I placed veneer discs purposefully under the final surface. So they created a very faint raising on the top layer that was only exposed once it was sanded, and that meant it kind of created an inlay effect. It was like a kind of industrialised marquetry, if you like, and this was an exhibition where the pieces of work were in Rotterdam. The second project I'll very quickly go through is for Corian and DuPont near Padova in Italy. This one was had a bit more of a commercial outset. The goal was very open-ended though. The factory that we visited, that we spent time with, spent a lot of time making one-off kitchens and really high-end cabinetry, and they were really aware that a price point of tens of thousands of euros meant that bespoke commissions are a pretty risky business model. So what they wanted was to find a kind of production line, and they collaborated with Largo, who are kind of like they're an Italian manufacturer that's kind of like Habitat. They've got their like lifestyle kind of, but at a budget that a lot of people can afford, furniture manufacturer and distributor. So they wanted, what Largo asked me and two friends who are also in the picture to do was who are also designers, to find a way of making something that was producible for about 300 euros instead of tens of thousands. And while we were there, we quickly realised that the most economically hungry stages of the manufacturing process was the mould making at the beginning and the hand finishing at the end. And the material itself was not actually that expensive. So it was the prep and the man hours involved that was adding all the costs. So, and while we were drawing up the furniture that we were planning to make with the sheets, we were just saying how nice it would be if we could get rid of molds and just push and pull it like you can in the computer, like on a sheet. So this is how the range was developed, and it's called You're Getting on My Nerves. And the sheet, so basically we worked with sheet material that was on the hotbed, and it gets warm and becomes pliable, and usually they put it straight into the mold and they press it, but instead we made these felt buttons that push and pull on the nerve points. And well, I'll show you a video because it explains it much better. Ooh, hopefully it will play. So it's quite a quick process. It comes straight off the bed onto this thing, then we have this forklift truck pushing down on sheets of Corian, and these felt buttons, we made them in different increments, like in bum increments. So A single one is for an armchair or a rocking chair, and then the other one is for a sofa. So that's kind of a really, but because it's held in the frame and it doesn't need a mold, it just gets pressed and the next one comes out, it reduces the price a lot. And we were really happy these went to Milan that year with Largo. So these sorts of projects, they're just two of a range of projects that I sort of did working directly with manufacturing. What all happens kind of in the run up to my PhD proposal being accepted, and kind of informs the questions and the focus deeply once I began the research. I felt it was important to kind of take my intuitive practice led research into a kind of academic realm, if you like, using the official research terms, things like archives and curating and critical discourse and peer reviewing, things that was really new to me. And so when I saw a call out for a curatorial fellowship at the Crafts Council, where I would get access to all their archives and expertise and be part of that conversation around craft, I went for it. The focus for the fellowship was to look at formalizing a kind of a language or a route for the different scales of production presented by craft and industry to speak to each other a bit more fluently. So this was like kind of just, I'm still really at the beginning of my PhD, but coming towards the end of this fellowship. So the key theme was exposing material language independent of material scale or outcome. And I wanted to kind of explore words or verbs that are arranged and rearranged during the journey of a material. I was really informed by this exhibition by Barbara Oskaby, called In the Making of the Design Museum. And it kind of halted objects during their industrial manufacture. That's what their number 1 and number 2 figures are. And I kind of felt like these moments of pausing areas are the moments for intervention, where a person is able to step in and disrupt like a kind of programmed set of events. And so I set about trying to put together a taxonomy of actions that you can kind of intervene with and moments. So I looked quite a lot at tools, and also the idea that you can have all the best tools in the world, but the craftsperson or a person full stop in the production process is the one who's got the sensory feedback from the material, who can see it, smell it, feel it, hear it, and they're the ones who will respond to things that might come up, or know whether things are going according to plan during the production process. So I came to this point where I felt that the crafts and skill actually translates to control over materials, tools, action sequence and scale. And it basically, these are the things you need in order to turn an idea into an object. And unless you can make it, it will only ever stay an idea. But I felt like having finite number of actions didn't really work for making, because it's so complicated. There's so many different kinds of cutting, so many different kinds of pressing, so many different kinds of these processes, that it felt more like a just trying to find my place in my notes, sorry. Okay, yeah, there's so many kinds that it made sense to move to a more phylogenetic genetic tree with multiple branches rather than definite categories. And so looking at the archive, that I sort of identified areas that I might work with, and then if you could imagine, they would be the kind of lead actions, and then all the other kind of sub actions would come off that. These are just, it's just for demonstration purposes, not an exhaustive list of what happens. Now, I was imagining the journey of, if you were to take these actions, then you were to imagine the journey an object would take through its production process. It would start, maybe it would go through cut, then go through push, then go through press. And sometimes it's much more complicated than that, and you end up with a very complicated journey. Or something where there's two different materials that change and move apart and come back together again. But what became really clear through my research was that rather than a linear, convenient progression of making, which is what I thought at the outset, actually it's much more complicated than that. And it reminded me of a TED talk I saw by Kirkby Ferguson called "Everything is a Remix." And basically, I started feeling that in order to make this conversation between the two scales work, I needed to think about how we actually remix making rather than just shuffling it. So here is his principles of remix. You copy, then you combine, and then you transform. And it felt like it was much more this kind of progressive thing where everything is referring back to each other. Here's some ceramic insulators, they're actually really huge. And then the work of Nick Leeson and a hand potter, and it's just how like everything, you can see the relationship between them, but you couldn't really say what came first and what didn't. So in the end, what I decided to do was to explore these ideas through physical collections of objects, grouped together under kind of curatorial umbrellas that also refer to each other. They're not absolute edges, they're not hard edges. They've got very blurry edges, and because they're all kind of concerned with the same thing. They're all referring to each other. And the idea was that rather than edges, I would think about the central principles rather than thinking about the peripheries. So each umbrella is kind of based on something shared by both the industrial and craft making practices, and a piece of very short text will provide a loose thread that connects the projects. And this is to be published in the coming weeks at the Craft Council website. It was going to be a physical show, but obviously not anymore because of COVID. So it's just going to be like a digital online collection. Collection 1 is based around hands manipulating machine outcome, and it's vaguely around variations on the blank. So it's how repeated uniform molded parts come out of a mechanized production process, but how usually the human hand comes in, but it's often hidden or something that is not normally talked about afterwards, like especially in the industrial ceramics. It's the person who's fettling the piece that makes it look machine perfect, but you would never know. The better they do the job, the less you know that they were there. The same with the veneer, the people in the factory who do the veneering. But something else that I noticed while I was looking at these objects is that there are some things that are shared across industrial and craft or one-off production. In an industrial process and also in the hand-built scale, handles are always added after the moulding process. And also sometimes they make spouts separately. So the objects that I'll be taking from the archive are things that are made from these repeated forms that are then manipulated and put back together again. This is Hans Koper, but then also this is Gwyn Hansen Pigott, and she would throw the forms and then pull them gently to make their spouts. Collection 2 is hands and machine working together. So this is swatches and explorations, people reveling in the process to find new and unexpected outcomes, or disrupting an established process, intervening with the tools of technique on a level. It's basically, it's not a person coming in and dealing with the production process. It's where they're completely symbiotic. And I'll just show you this very short bit of film of how the hand is completely integrated within the production process of these insulators. Can you hear the music that goes with it? Oh, you can't? That's a shame. And I really love like how it goes from this big guy, and then he'll pass it on to the next person who also works with it by his hands, but it's a completely different setup. It's kind of like the rough hewing out, and then it goes to this very precise, kind of almost sanitized environment where it gets fine-tuned. And I just felt like these are the moments where there's a potential for overlap and intervention, and deciding like it's the sensibilities and sensitivities of a human that come into the industrial production line, and whether they change what they're doing as a corrective measure, or even if it goes out of this where there's a predicted outcome and it becomes something that's just more about exploration or research or curiosity. But if you get a chance to watch this video all the way through, it's pretty amazing. Look at that. Okay, so the next so in light of this, there's lots of projects that are dealing with how you can intervene with moments during the industrial process, and this is a project from the Granby workshop from Assemble, and they noticed that slip casting molds are often made in parts, but they decided to make like a modular system where they could produce a wide variety of outcomes using the same molds. And this is another project that was done not that long ago, actually, only about 3 years ago, I think it was, that showed the hand traces of the people who are handling all these objects who we never normally see. And by using some gloves with cobalt salts embedded in them to highlight the moments where objects are being touched, and you can really see where objects get manipulated more by hand. And another project produced by Benchmark, the well-proven chair, also it's sort of this overlap between one part of it is molded and the rest of it is kind of formed out of this material that's made from wood shavings and bioplastics, bioresin. It kind of grows into the mold form. So you've got the bit that needs to be precise, the way that the feet hit the ground and the way that the seat meets the body is precise, but the rest of it is allowed to just be free. And the last collection that I'm proposing is something called Out of Industrial Context. So it's when you're basically taking a tool or a technique from the industry out into the world. And I don't know if many of you are familiar with this project from Neil Brownsword with called Vita, and she made all the flowers in a ceramics factory in Stoke-on-Trent, and it was about how when all the industries shut down, her skills were becoming redundant too, and she was just sat in the gallery making these flowers and throwing them on the floor. It's pretty powerful. And then a few years ago, I think it was 2013, there was a project all about perfume and the role of the nose and the craft of perfuming. Design Marketo made a full sensory exhibition with a dinner and objects, and then also this pepper was everywhere, and it was called Pepper Served. And then this is another example of where something from industry has been brought into another context. This is the Baum cake. They make these cakes in Germany. It just rotates and they pour the batter over it and it builds up in these layers. And this is the fuzz tables by Studio Portable, made using jasmonite in a similar technique. And then the jigger in jollying, coming out to make these very precise sandcastles. This is Parsons and Charlesworth from Spectacular Vernacular show that they did in Chicago about 3 years ago. And of course, Max Lamb's pewter store that he took the idea of sandcasting from a foundry out onto the beach. So it kind of felt like, so far where I've got to in my research, and it's still very early, is that one way of exploring this through practice could be through looking at this relationship between repeated objects and where a person can start intervening. So I kind of was thinking about the industrialized repetition of an action, and then if we start to shuffle that with other actions, like what if we shuffle it with other kinds of making verbs. And while I was reading around, this show just opened last month actually, curated by Lee Edelcourt, and it's called A Labour of Love, and it's an exhibition that looks back over the world's 2-decade-long obsession with material and experimentation. And I just find it quite interesting that there's so much going on discourse-wise at the moment with this, and I don't think I could say it better than she does, but I can't read the whole screen because I can still see all the boxes there, but it says I think you can probably read it. I can't manage to get to it because I've got all the videos. But it says that at the turn of the new century, people returned to craft. And there's one line that I particularly love, where she talks about this phenomenon as a Edward Scissorhands kind of idea, where designers begin hacking printers, reconstructing looms, inventing new or bespoke half-manual, half-automated machine. It's a beautiful period in which man and machine begin working hand in hand. And I really love this idea that instead of it being two separate scales or industries or approaches to making, it's kind of more this transboundary situation where I think, and also Hella actually spoke about this as well. She said design is not about products, it's about relationships. Good design can draw, almost invisibly, on different levels of meaning to communicate with users. Without friction at the boundaries, there's no personal signature, no intimate relationship with the user. And I think it's this friction or this clashing scale, the clashing scale of manufacture between one-offs and multiples, or the friction between hand and machine. It's kind of the turbulent whitewash of chaos of new possibilities. And my research has become more about trying to find a route or methodology for hands and machine to come together. It's not really a clash, but a productive kind of transboundary tension that gives way to new unseen possibilities. And like these two oceans in the Gulf of Alaska, we can try to name the scales of making craft or industrial, but the edges will always remain fluid, shifting with the tide, and I feel it's very limited as to how useful it can be to define the edges of a practice, and it's better by far to understand the central principles and let the edges merge in gorgeous chaos. And that's the end.
Fantastic. Thank you very much, Shai. What an
You're
interesting
welcome. That's
presentation.
the first time I've presented this sort of work, so I hope it was coherent.
Oh, that's exciting to know. Oh, well, we're very privileged to be the first place that you presented such work. I just have one little clarification before we move on. We won't have a full questioning session now, but this is the topic of your PhD.
Yeah.
And when you are at a dinner party and someone goes, "Oh, you're doing a PhD. What's it about?" What do you say?
I normally say, truthfully, it's about craft and industry, but it was an excuse for me to travel and look at how people make things and get loads of swatches.
So it's your core. I guess what I'm trying to uncover is your core research question. Is it how do craft and industry interact?
Well,
or something? What's your core driving question?
I really thought it was just that because I'd been making so many things with factories, and I got the same swatch book all the time with the same textures and the same patterns. It was just that I was fed up of everything looking the same, and I just thought there was an easier way to have variation within the industrial manufacturing process. And I just thought there was so much more, and there's all these amazing craft skills that are so locally specific. Like, why can't we bring weaving into the factory if that's what's happening in that area? Why does it have to ignore what's going on nearby? And what does it mean to say, and like maybe in one place the weaving would be reeds, or in another place the weaving would be wool, and another place the weaving would be metal. And I just think it can be so much more exciting to say made in ...
I mean, there's so much in your presentation. It's absolutely intriguing, and you do have this lovely early PhD quality of the whole. You know, you've just got, there's so much in there, and it's well, we can come back to this in the discussion. I've got so many more questions for you. Everybody else, please do write any comments, thoughts, or questions that occur to you into the chat. And Shai, can you transfer hostship over to Paola? Brilliant, thank you. Paola,
Yes.
you are up.
I'll try not to stop the meeting again.
I'm just trying to figure out how to do this. Paola, have I done it?
It says host disable attendee screen sharing.
Okay,
so,
let me see if I can. Oh, there we go.
Success, I think.
Okay, so can you see?
Yes.
Can you talk?
We can see your whole presentation.
Okay.
Yeah, now we can.
Okay, so off I go. I'm just putting a timer, otherwise I talk too much. Okay, I'm Paola. So I'm gonna present a series called Borderlands, the Edges of Europe. Is a project that I started around end of 2011, 2012, and is a photographic series that aims to narrate life at the edges of Europe, with an idea of looking at sort of where does Europe end. Just trying to work out how to move my slides. So is a photographic series that I would say sits somewhere between documentary and portraiture photographic practices, and focus on the land border. The land border sort of where Europe ends, so juxtaposing the concept of what is the geographical Europe to that of the political Europe and European Union. The red line on the map is where I have photographed. You will see that, for example, I have excluded Switzerland, which is not part of the EU, but I have excluded it because it doesn't have, you know, limitation for European citizens to pass through. So as an Italian, I can always go into Switzerland. The red line, I am now, would say, toward the end of the project, although because the European Union keeps changing, I might actually never finish the project, because the more they change, the more I have to photograph. I developed, later on I will say a bit more about my methodology. I developed the work mostly by walking. So I have walked along the majority of that red line. I have a couple of spots, couple of countries that I need to finish in the past year and a half, first for family issues and then for the pandemic, I was not able to travel. And also there's a couple of spots that I would like to revisit because I think they might have slightly changed, but I have generally walked the majority of that line. So I do the project by walking on foot long distances. I do sometimes cheat and hitchhike. So the project over the years, I've received funding by the Arts Council England and the European Cultural Foundation. I would say I'm roughly at the output stage. So the project has been in various exhibitions and publications, although I have so much material that at the moment I'm also having to scan a lot of negatives, and because it's also all analog photographs, so I have to then scan the negatives. The idea of the project is to represent communities that are otherwise excluded from mainstream narratives. So often we hear about what central government says, or if we hear about borders, we hear about borders of Europe because there is some drama related to immigration and people trying to cross into Europe, but we never hear about people that actually live on those borders in their daily life and communities there for which the border is their home. And the idea for the project for me was quite personal. So I don't know if you can see me hovering with the mouse of my computer, but somewhere here between Italy, Slovenia, and Croatia. So that was I grew up with my grandmother, and my grandmother family was from this area. Although my grandmother was born in Switzerland as a refugee during the First World War. This land that her family had lost is something that hugely affected her, and so much that she went on to fight in the Second World War as a partisan against Mussolini, because she had this slightly unrealistic idea that she was going to gain back the land. I grew up with her, and she had a huge post-traumatic stress because of the war. And in my house, she was called the Yugoslavian grandmother because she was a bit nuts. So anytime my mom argued, my mom would say, she was my mother's mother. My mother would say, we are Yugoslavic. So in Italy, growing up in the 80s, there was a huge emphasis of like, yay, we are the European Union. And at home, I had these ideas of this person that was slightly unhinged because she came from the other side. She came from where the Slavic came from. And so when I was a teenager and I started hitchhiking through Europe, I tried to find this hypothetical land where she came from. And I couldn't find it because she actually didn't really know where her family was from. But what I found this was even before I started doing photography, I found a lot of areas which along the borders, none of the countries was claiming. So large parts of land in proximity of the borders, they were empty because Italy didn't want to upset Slovenia and build on them, and Slovenia didn't want to take something that Italy might be offended about. So years later, when I started doing photography, I decided to start looking at this idea of borders, and also what is the meaning and relevance of European identities nowadays, and how is that identity affected by borders. And for example, I started looking at Greece because when I started around 2011, there was a huge economic crisis and there were talks about excluding Greece from the European Union that I found, to me personally, were quite insane, because I grew up with this idea that essentially Greece has given us democracy and Greece has given us European culture. But also started looking at how the presence of the border affects identity and how it relates to ideas of home, belonging, and how do we relate to the territory we inhabit, and how is shaped by past or current events such as the economic crisis. And also looking at what are the commonalities and differences in this identity across borders. And sort of, this is a quote from an article, I think it's an anthropology article, in which somebody defined borders as time written in space, which is something I really like the definition. And so I started looking at commonalities of borderlands, so marks of past or current conflicts, economic downturn, but also identities that are prone to change. And this image was one of the first images I shot trying to reach the town of Marassia, which is the last town last town in Greece close to Turkey. And when I reached the bridge had fallen down, and because there was a massive economic crisis, nobody was fixing it, so I had to swim across. But also along borders we find both the sign, for example, of past events, such as all on the more Soviet side, like Moldova, Ukraine, Russia, all this Soviet architecture, and also all these signs that reminds us that the Soviet Union won the Second World War and tanks. But also how, for example, that fall of the Soviet Union has created this huge post this huge capitalist rush. For example, in the town of Utskorod, I was the only guest of this gigantic banana-themed hotel. And the fact that it was all capitalist speculation. There has been a huge thing. So who could make money has made money at the fall of the Soviet Union, because I mean, there's some architects here. It's pretty insane to build a banana hotel that nobody will ever visit except me. But also started looking at the people that live along those borders, and communities that sometimes feel like they are really not reflected by that core of national identity. So for example, Romania, Ukraine, the border is the river Danube, which is the delta of the Danube. So it's an area that it's practically impossible to patrol and control. So it's very easy to cross between countries. And for example, there is a community like this lady, they are called Lipovan, and they identify as Russians. Although they are mostly Romanian citizens, they don't speak Romanian, they identify purely as Russians, and they mostly live on boats crossing between the two countries almost as they please, because the delta of the Danube is so big that it's impossible to patrol it. And so it's looking at how people also perceive this presence of the border, and looking, for example, at where there is an hard border that is not only, sometimes is reflected by a very strong infrastructure, but sometimes is reflected by almost a feeling of that people have toward the other side, such as in the Balkans, where there were all those cemeteries from the Balkan War. And for example, between Serbia and Croatia, so I visited this in 2013 when Croatia just joined the European Union. The Danube is the border, and the Danube keeps overflowing. And when I ask, very naively ask, you know, why do you keep building so close to the river if every other month it floods your house? The reason was because during the Balkan War, they were able to survive and escape the Serbian invasion because they hid in the rising water. And so they saw it as the Croatian government is not able to defend us, the European Union has not defended us, but the Danube is there, and the Danube has been on our side and has allowed us to survive. So they were happy for the house to be flooded, essentially. And also their borders, they are bizarrely very soft, because if you look at the border Lithuania-Belarus, my garden fence is higher and stronger than that thing. So between Lithuania and Belarus, there is literally this little metal fence. And at the fall of the Soviet Union, the borders between the Baltic countries was done with a satellite, and literally cuts through people's garden, through villages. So this little yellow ribbon was a border post in somebody's garden. So somebody at the house that was half in Lithuania, half in Belarus, and their children were using the border post as goalpost to play football. And those people could constantly go in and out between countries because it was their garden. And what was interesting is how the local are related, because along the border Lithuania-Belarus, neither Belarusian nor Lithuanian were spoken. This is the only border I visited with a Lithuanian friend, and she was constantly upset because no one could speak Lithuanian. People only spoke Russian or Polish. There are huge Polish communities. And there was it's very sweet and funny situation, like the lady in the picture, there was a church worshipper, she asked me if I wanted apples, and I said, yeah, thank you. And she literally walked up to the border with the Belarus, opened up the border, went into Belarus, took some apples and came back, and then closed the border like it was a back garden. Or the guy on the other side, there was the gardener for the local cemetery, and he was Belarusian, but would cross over into Lithuania daily, not through an official border crossing. He would literally move the fence and come in and then go home at night. And that was because those are very remote areas. It's very difficult they are very depopulated. It's difficult for the Lithuanian side to find workforce because everybody moves to the city. But also there was a local understanding from the local border guards that it would be impossible financially for people to go to the capital city, get an official permit and drive 200 kilometers to the first border crossing. So it was absolutely accepted that people could cross and move the border as long as they didn't try to smuggle cigarettes. And those communities were really close-knitted, close borders. So there were people that literally saw themselves as not part of either country. They saw themselves as un-Polish or un-Russian. And our community, our city, our town is on both sides of the fence. A little bit about the methods. So I mostly use an old analog camera. It's not only an aesthetic choice. So I have the camera here. I can show it again later. The reason is because it's illegal to photograph along most borders. The Cyprus buffer zone is the only border where I actually sought permission to photograph, but it's too complicated. And normally if I get stopped, because it happens by border guards, when they see this, it makes them realize that I'm not a journalist and I've never had an issue. And also having an old camera, I found it's normally quite a good talking points with the people I meet, because I often rely on their hospitality in places I go, because they tend to be very remote areas. And so I tend to walk in close proximity of the border. I use a map and a compass. And I don't use a mobile phone satellite because of the roaming charges. And I almost has become, I tried at the beginning to consider driving or even cycling. So I sometimes cheat by hiking, but I almost walk. And I found walking is the only way I could do this, because it almost becomes the act of making the photos is one thing with the walking, because it almost have become for me a way to physically feel the presence of the border. It's quite difficult to explain, but I don't get lost. I mean, sometimes I get lost, but I kind of know where the border is all the time. And it's also a way to meet people and talk to them. And there have been, for example, this was a Orthodox priest that was moving from village to village, and he gave me, I went around with him for a bit in his little red car, and at some point I realized we had crossed into Albania, but we'd just gone up a dirt track, so I didn't have any legal permission to be an Albanian, so I was essentially an illegal immigrant, which is actually quite ironic, because normally Italians accuse the Albanians of being illegal immigrants into Italy. So I had to quickly escape and return on the Greek side. But a big part for me is also this walking and looking at the border and following the boundary, and also connecting with people and having conversation. And for example, the surprising things I find, like this lady, turned out she had lived in Italy, she could speak Italian. So between her Italian and I speak a bit of Russian, she walked with me along the border in the town of Leova, and she started pointing at me all the spots where things had happened during the war, such as the spot where her grandfather tried to, where the Romanian army had invaded during the Second World War, and where her grandfather tried to stop the Romanian/Nazi army from attacking the Jews. And the city of Leova is the site of one of the biggest mass deportation of children, Jewish children. And she indicated to me a lady that was the only survivor, and I tried to find her. I only found an empty house, unfortunately. But it's also me, so I collect all the stories. Initially, I tried to do it very methodically, recording interviews, but it became very impractical because people did not want to be interviewed. So that's the next step. I started instead talking to them and then taking annotation, so making memories. And over the years, I've started collecting maps, which I normally take notes on. But then I started using those maps together with text to present in exhibitions. So this was a collage of maps that was really big, that was done on a gallery wall. The output so has been in various photography festivals and exhibitions. And there's again, I have a lot of materials I'm still going through, so eventually it might take some other configuration or some new exhibitions. And there's been also in artist talks and publications. So for example, last year I did a conference, and then a chapter in a book was published from it. And then what's next? Because I've also started looking in terms of, it's quite time consuming to go and photograph borders, what I could do more related to the UK. And so I started looking at the fact that at this rate with Brexit, I will soon fulfill my dream of actually living on the border once the UK is out. But I thought a lot of photographers are doing work related to Brexit, so I didn't want to go for the obvious. And one thing I noticed is that since the Brexit referendum, there's been a huge sprung up of St. George cross flags around the countries. And I find it very interesting when in the countryside you find people who have put up these huge poles with a flag, because, I mean, who are you signaling to that you're in England? You're in the middle of nowhere, people know you're in England. So what I started doing is knocking on people's door and trying to speak to them, and asking if I can take the portraits. And a lot of time people tell me to piss off. Suspect a bit is because I'm a foreigner, but could be just because they don't want to be photographed. But then sometimes some slightly bizarre characters open the door, such as this lady. There was a Northern Irish Protestant, very militant, that was very friendly to me till she mentioned killing all the Catholics. And then she asked in the middle of conversation, "You're Italian, are you Catholic?" And I had to quickly say that I'm an atheist, I'm not Catholic. So she let me, she was really friendly, but I found it very interesting how she had the sort of attached herself to this symbolism, and she had all these flags of St. George. And then, because I like going around, I started looking at this cult of St. George and the St. George cross, because he's the only saint that is venerated in every country of the planet. There's a St. George church in every country of the planet. So I have started looking at places where they have kind of see, so in England there's this cross of St. George and like the Crusader and the defender of the land or whatever it is. And I started looking at, for example, countries like Georgia or Armenia, who have a very strong connection to this cult of St. George, a sort of saint protector. And what I find, and this is something I literally scan those images with my phone, is very much work in progress. I find it very interesting, this cult which has merged with the cult of the Roman god Mitra. So there is this, what interests me is how this cult of St. George has sort of gone across borders and across countries. Well, this is where I'm at now. Yeah, that's all. So thank you for listening.
Thank you, Paola. That was a really fantastic presentation. Beautiful photographs.
How do I?
If you click, yeah, you got it.
And then can I give it back?
Now you've done it. That's good. I don't need to be made host particularly.
Okay.
You can continue being the host. I really enjoyed how personal your presentation is.
Thank you.
And how integral you are to this research. And it strikes me that both you and Shai are in some ways at the center of your own research, because it's through your bodily interaction with these spaces and places and objects that you start to uncover facts. I was particularly intrigued by you saying that you can feel the presence of the border.
Yeah, I know it's there. It's strange. I've started feeling it. It's almost like, I don't know, maybe I'm started losing my mind, but I know where it is all the time. It's like,
So you find you know where it is even when there's no people there to indicate it?
yes.
And when there's no objects there to indicate it?
You know it, because there's little things, a lot of borders, like the Finland-Russian border. I didn't meet a single person, but there's cameras everywhere. And they are very hidden, and they have motion sensors, so you kind of start spotting those little things. But sometimes it's just, I don't know, I started maybe noticing little little markers, or sometimes not ever. In some places the border is not so evident. Like sometimes it's just a sign that says "do not continue," and then there is like 500 meters in between. I don't know if I just got used to it, but sort of, yeah, started sort of feeling is there.
That's an intriguing thing. Have you started to document ever what are the tiny clues?
Yeah, I mean, I have pictures of a bit of everything. I mean, I have a lot of photos which are a bit boring, of photos telling me do not continue, and there is this sign. And also signs like, you know, there are very remote areas, so I find it quite funny when the sign saying do not continue or border has fallen on the side. And, you know, just, well, nobody comes here. So, yeah, I have a lot of little, yeah. It's quite difficult to make a selection also of what to show, because I possibly have a lot of fairly boring pictures of trees and forest, and yeah.
Well, that's an interesting question of how you decide whether or not something's boring.
Yes, I mean, also I still have a huge amount of work to go through and document, so it's fun. So still, yeah.
I wondered, Shai, if you're still around, I wondered if you each had any comments or questions, or would like to draw any parallels between your two presentations.
I just really enjoyed listening to the stories from all the pictures. I felt like the research really came to life while you were explaining it, Paola. It was like, then I felt like, yeah, it's fantastic. I really enjoyed listening to your talk.
I like the fact that you showed all things that sort of there's a participation in kind of the making, the act of actually doing it, because I think there's also a lot of design that is done. I mean, I'm not a designer, but kind of just, you know, planned and then somebody else peruse it. Well, there was the sense of craft, and I like the fact that there was like the shape that would make the chair, and kind of, yeah.
I really liked the parallels, even though they were very different topics, the parallels between your two presentations. And Shai, one of the things I really was intrigued by was what looked, and I'm not sure if I had this right, what looked like an attempt to start to represent this multi-dimensional data that you're collecting in diagrams with spots and lines, and you had at one point an animated one.
Yeah.
And I wondered, Paola, if you had ever started to represent your findings in other ways other than through photography, you know, like through making diagrams of, or making, you know, this thing that Shai had done with the charts. Do you know what I'm talking about?
Yeah, it's the chart. Not really. I mean, I do keep like the maps onto which I sort of tend to write a lot on them. And I always have like a notebook where I make notes and then take down people addresses, because then I send them the images. Or sometimes I more have a collection of very rough drawing sketches, annotation, and mess that I keep. I think in everything, not only this photography, also in my much more commercial fashion photography practice, I keep a lot of sketchbooks.
Yes.
Where, you know, and I think it's also like it becomes a part of like also the people I meet, taking down what they say, also, as I said earlier on, I tend to speak with people, the majority of it in Russian. My Russian, don't ask me to speak now, my Russian is fairly terrible. It's a survival Russian. So sometimes if I don't understand them, I make them write down stuff. And then I'll deal with it later. So I have this collection of, so I normally, I try to travel very light. So I normally have very few clothes with me, and I just have the camera and the film I use. And normally I come back with a bag that is full of a lot of maps and notes and stickers and things, and some old lady has given me jam, this kind of thing. But no, not, you know.
So you collect a huge amount of data in different forms.
Yes, jam form, but then I come home and then it's a pile in my desk somewhere, and then it stays there till I find the time to scan it. And it's like now I have a huge collection of St. George icons of all possible form, and so I have this pile of religious memorabilia going in a corner.
Well, I think another thing that seems to you seem to have in common is that you have a practice which is a personally driven project of great interest, but that you're switching mode in order to be in line with the academy, so that you're academicizing what you're doing. And Shai, you're doing it very deliberately because you're undertaking a PhD, and Paola is doing it in a slightly more, maybe, I don't know, forced fashion, because she is doing this. The ref is coming up and we want to submit Paola for the ref, so she has been academicizing this practice-based research that she's been undertaking, and it's a whole new language.
A bit reluctantly, as my colleagues.
A bit reluctantly.
I mean, I do occasionally read, and it's just, for me, it's a very, you know, almost, there's also something I think quite vernacular about what I do. I spend a lot of time talking to old ladies. It's, you know, there are areas that are very depopulated, that it's not, so a lot of people who, you know, farmers, old men, children, random strangers there, I will invite me in their house because I need a place to stay. So I never set out to do and be, you know, I read book occasionally, and I have some books like the Imagined Community by Anderson is quite a common book. There's few books to talk about that, few books about European identity, but you know, I also find sometimes quite difficult to read those books, because then I start going, no, it's not like that, no, the borders are not like that.
Interesting. Well, that's indeed why you should be undertaking research, isn't it? By the way, if anybody from the floor would like to engage in this conversation, please either just butt in or stick your hand up if you've got any questions for the presenters or any comments or anything you'd like to add. But Shai, I wanted to ask you if you could say a bit about this translation between your craft method and your engagement as a practice, and your mental and also psychological, and I suppose the word is, the process that you've been through to translate that into a practice-based PhD.
It's very complicated. It's like, I feel like as a designer, designer is a weird title, but as someone who's first thinking about objects and having ideas that I need to translate, I feel like I'm always translating, either translating something from my mind into a drawing, or talking to the person who's going to make it with me, like how I'm going to make it, or talking to the client. It feels like it's always translating. So then the idea, it's just another language. Like either I'm speaking to someone about how to make it, I'm speaking to someone about how to understand it, and then I'm speaking to someone about how it sits in the bigger conversation. And from my own point of view, something that I found really reassuring and really interesting is just understanding contextually a bit more about what's going on, because we all like live in this echo chamber where we see other things that we like, and especially in London, it's so saturated with similar-minded people that it's just great to get in the discipline of looking outside and seeing what else is going on. And for example, the cobalt project that I showed you, where they put the cobalt in the gloves, was something that I had already just started doing in the workshop. And it was just, at first when I saw the exact same project, I was a bit devastated because I was like, that was my plan. I knew what I was doing for the next few weeks. But actually, it just made me feel like I must be on the right track. If someone has already been doing that and it's interesting and people are talking about it, then okay, fine, I don't need to do that. What comes next? And it's just things like that have been very interesting because it's a different way of looking at work and how you progress work than I normally do. But it is, I do often have to just have the dictionary.com open while I'm reading anything because it's just a totally different language.
Absolutely, although one that you seem to be adopting. I mean, I noticed you effortlessly using the word ludic. And
that's from my
had to look that up.
Oh, did you? Only because that was from a project that I did with the Leverhulme Trust, where I was trying to find a word that was like about this kind of goalless exploration, and I found lots of words about tempting and like irresistible urges and ludic play and all of these sorts of things, because sometimes it's nice to have the precise language to talk about things.
Absolutely, I couldn't agree more. And that quality of ludicness, if that's a word, I don't suppose it is, but this open-ended, playful quality is something that both of your work really has. And it's something that is often found in practice-based research. It's one of the really enjoyable things about it. I'm keen for somebody else in the room to ask a question or make a comment. Everybody's very quiet and very invisible.
I can ask a question, Jane.
Go on, Jacek. That would be great.
No, it was just a comment. First of all, thank you so much. Really, really interesting presentations, and I always love seeing the different disciplines, and it just really showcases our school in the way that we really combine such an eclectic bunch of people and really interesting practices. It wasn't so much a question, but just a comment that in both of these cases, because obviously both of you are practitioners and reflecting on your work through academic sort of framing, I wonder whether the academic framing actually is highlighting the journey that you're going through. I'm thinking as an example with Paola. So obviously you've got the practice, and then you've got the outcome of the practice is the image itself. But actually, by articulating your practice in this academic way, we're getting so much more, this fascinating story behind it. And similarly with Shai, whose practice I know less, but it's the first time I encounter your practice. But I can definitely see that that there's something about that when we frame something academically, it actually helps us to bring to the surface narratives that otherwise might not actually reach the audience. Would you? Am I making?
You're making sense
point?
To me.
Yeah.
Shai, do you want to comment on?
I totally agree. And thanks for your nice comments. But yeah, I completely agree that when you start looking at it from a different angle, it's just uncovering other layers. And I did have a point that I was going to make, but maybe someone else can say something. While I'm just trying to remember what it was. It was to do with Paola. Yeah. Anyway, yeah.
I think there is often a tendency to see giving something the academic language as taking away its joy or taking away what makes it special. And I know certainly here at the research seminar, that's the opposite of what we want to achieve with these conversations. We want to reveal the specialness and reveal why these methods are the only way that you can find out the type of data, for want of a better word, that you are uncovering. There isn't another way. There isn't a more scientific way to do it. Sorry, Paola.
I just had a difficult question in the chat side.
Yes. Shall I? Do you want to read it out, or shall I read it out?
Yeah, no, I'm just slightly yes. So,
so she says the theme. So this is from Bo Tang, and she says the theme for our MArch Architecture Studio, which is Unit 6, the architecture of rapid change and scarce resources, is borders and boundaries, and they've adapted that from Senate. She says there's an important distinction between the two kinds of edges. The boundary is an edge where things end. The border is an edge where different groups interact. And their students, apparently there's a few of them in here just now, are looking for boundaries to be transformed into borders as common civic grounds and to introduce appropriate social infrastructure. And she wonders if you, during your research, have come across this condition where the boundary can become a border.
So I would say, if I understand correctly, I think from a government point of view, all those borders I walk are meant to be boundaries. So they are meant to be almost container of a country. You know, they sort of define, contain, and almost is like, well, we are Italy because Italy ends there, or we are, I don't know, Russia or Latvia because it finished there. In practice, when you talk to people that live on them, they are not boundaries. They are always borders where group interacts. So whether in the good or in the bad, because it doesn't mean that the physical infrastructure, the division, whether you have a river or a fence or whatever you find, sometimes the interaction can be a positive one or can be a negative one for many historical reasons, but at the same time, they are never boundaries. There is always a contact with the other side. Whether it's the Greek lady that warns me that the Turks are on the other side because the Turks throw you rocks, and I've seen it, or whether it is the people that says, well, yes, we are Latvians, but actually our mother tongue is Russian, so we are with the other side. And it's, I don't think I've ever seen a border where you can't make a closed container of people. Just and it could be for the simplest reason. In Finland, people wanted to go into Russia because petrol is much cheaper. So that people, you know, there was this thing that community had formed to the point that somebody told me, oh, I'm close to the other side because I have a lover on the other side and I go there to get petrol because it's much cheaper. So I think this idea, I think there is always this idea of having infrastructure that become this container of our national pride. You know, I think you've seen it here in the UK. Are we going to put the border in the sea in Northern Ireland, or are we making Kent into a car park? But effectively, when you have a contact, there is land. Those people are people a bit like my grandmother who had a connection with that territory well before the current government came around. So it's something that has come through times. There's always a connection, good or bad, with the other side. I hope
I think somebody, Andrew wants to ask you a question.
Oh no, that's gonna be really difficult.
Don't make it too difficult.
No, I hope not. I hope not, Paolo, because it's a question from within photography. I was very interested in the square format, and you answered that question because it's obviously a technical part of the camera. But what it does for me with the composition is it creates a stability, and I've used this in painting square in square canvases myself. But it creates a stability, and you center the people in the middle of the frame often when you're taking photos of them. So several questions. One is have you upped the color at all, or is that the color pretty much an analog color that you're getting there?
Yeah, that's the color I get.
Okay, because what I find interesting is there are flashes of color. A lot of those, there's the red jumper, there's the green piece of machinery, and then there's the St. George flag. So there's these, it's like signaling, it's like a semaphore.
There's no flash, nothing, it's just the camera.
But the flashes of color. So there are
in terms of color,
color, tiny segments of color that is like a semaphore. It's like a signaling, and there's also a kind of binding within the composition that also occurs in terms of the lines. There are lines in the composition that often lead to the people themselves. So going back to what you were talking about, and a kind of binding of their context, I just wonder, and I presume it's not necessarily conscious because it's just working on you through the medium, but is there something at work for you there within that kind of the signaling of the operation of the color, the positioning of the people within a very tight context? It's like a classic, obviously a classical compositional framing that you're using with the figures in the center there, but they're not taking up the frame. They're placed very much in the center of the frame with leading lines in a way straight into them, and they're bound in their context in the composition. It seems to me there's something working there for you.
Yeah, I mean, I think, you know, part of it was perhaps when I started subconscious, and then perhaps part of it is in the selection, because I think I have perhaps selected the images. Definitely I am attracted to that square format with the person in the center.
Mm-hmm.
I think it was originally, first of all, when I started the project, it was the only camera I had, because it was my dad's camera, so a bit was also necessity. So I started using that because that's what I had available. I do like the format. There's also a big thing about this camera being portable, and the fact that I don't look like this, I have to look from above. So
yes,
right.
Which is compositional capacity, because because of that difficulty. It's not automatic.
It's all manual. I don't see it as a difficulty. I see it as an advantage, because I find it very difficult to use digital camera and automatic stuff.
Mm-hmm.
In terms of the composition, I mean, I would say yes, I tend to put the person at the center, and keeping something where you see the surrounding. I have done also like half body shot or close up. I also done like interior shots, but then I found, for example, they weren't really working when I present the images together. In terms of, yes, the lines and the spots of color, that's perhaps me being a bit of a magpie and going like, oh, that looks red, ooh, there's a nice yellow ribbon. I think I'm naturally attracted to that, and something that I think to me was not really planned. It just came like that, and is how I see things. And then I think once I started selecting the images, and I started considering, okay, this works for me because it shows the person, it shows a bit of the background, and I'm able to explain who they are, why they are there. I then have started kind of doing more of the same images. So I don't know if I completely answer. I think my choices initially were quite subconscious, just mostly.
No, it does. And in terms of, I mean, Jane was talking about the academic language, but I think there's certainly a really interesting dialogue to be had between the formal manipulations that you're achieving and the theme and the project itself.
I think that's such an interesting point, Andrew. And I'm not I suppose, really an academic of visual objects in this way, but there's so many layers of analysis and self-reflection that you can do when you've done a project like Paola has, where she's undertaken this quite automatic process in a way, in terms of, you sounds like, Paola, you take the pictures without an enormous amount of thinking and planning, partly because of the nature of the environment that you're in.
Also because,
but yet there's this quality that might be similar across them, and that might tell you something else. I don't know what that might be, but I really like that you've picked that out, Andrew, because it's always so multidimensional and multi-layered, the potential for analysing what you've done and why.
Yeah, I think an important point would be that Paola's operating within the medium, and the medium is speaking, and
yes,
and it's operating at a level of that's not it's not forced.
Yeah, Andrew, you should have chaired this evening. That's such an interesting point, and I'm so sorry that we've run out of time. It's now 1 minute to 8, just as it was getting hotting up, but I need to go and read a story to my child in bed, and I'm sure everybody else has an evening to get to as well. Thank you so much, Shai and Paola. It was really great to have your presentations. Thank you to everybody else who's contributed. And next week we have Sunny Singh, Alex Katina, and chaired by Trevor, whose surname has momentarily escaped me, but they're going to be talking about the relationship between architecture and fiction. So it'd be really great to see some of you next week, and thank you very much again. Maybe if you all unmute yourselves and say goodbye, that would be lovely.
Thank you very much. Goodbye.
Bye.
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 2%. No.
Bye. Bye, Paola.
Good. Bye.
Bye.
I want to see more images, Paola. I'm looking forward to helping you edit and select at some point.
You can scan it all. Bye. Bye. Bye.
Bye.
Bye. Thank you.